quick version is we use it the way we teach it, exactly the way we teach it, right? There's no huge surprise here in that we teach everybody to do double links and then we do it ourselves, but then we don't do it ourselves, or like we use all the things that we also promote, but there are some fine print things that I would like to talk about. So what I would like to talk about today is history, structure, and a little bit about the individual kind of departments, and then some special concepts that people have also mentioned here, like the help desk principle and the communities of practice. And it's something that I also find interesting that we actually don't talk so much about within SOFA, but it is an interesting concept, and that is how do you do a process that spans over several circles? And we have an example of that. So. And the decentralization, that's more kind of future oriented of what are we struggling with that we know needs to happen, and it's really not so trivial to do. Okay, so a little bit on history, just for the sake of completeness, really, and one could actually even argue with each one of these things as writing of history goes. We founded in 2016, Jerry and myself. We started making videos and started Salt, and that was kind of the beginning. And then an interesting thing happened, and that is that SOFA was not intended to be a membership organization. Honestly, it wasn't not intended to be one. We just didn't think about it at all. So then what happened is that people graduated this program and said we want to join. We want to join, and so we said, okay, sure, let's make this a membership organization without having much of a plan of how that would look. Then also there was Many Voices One Song was written, then published in 2018 actually, but a lot of the writing happened here, so that took some resource out of 2017 in particular. Then 2018 the publishing of that, and we started the academy that I think then the first cohort was in 2019. So of course this doesn't fully fall into these different lines. And then we knew that we had to focus more on what we called easing replicability. So what we mean by that is all the things that already existed needed to be replicated in different sectors, in different languages, making it easier to build permutation of things. So less reinventing the wheel and more kind of reusing was the theme, and that needs infrastructure and it needs systems and so on. So we were basically slowing down a little bit on the outside and building a stronger core in that time. And that happened in 2020. We thought a little naively that would be 1 year of, oh, let's just focus on the internal stuff for a year, and then while still running everything else, and then let's do that, like grow more on the outside in 2020 and so on. But then of course the pandemic happened too, and it just never seems to end. The replicability is not so trivial, and we'll get to that also when it gets to growing edges. We just adopted a little while ago that help desk model that I'll be talking about. Who Decides Who Decides was published this year, and there's going to be a book coming next month or in November, which is Sociocracy for Children. And by the way, it's a little fun fact. It's also a little bit of a marker because it's the first book that I didn't write, but that's going to be published by SOFA as a publishing house. So it's that step that you'll see in as a theme, kind of drawn through everything from founder led to more member led as a transition overall. Real quick about me, as you see, I'm founder, but I'm also right now until I think I should have looked that up. I think my term is another 2 years as leader of the General Circle. So executive director is what it should say on business cards if I ever use them. Okay, so just a little bit of stats, and people from membership circle, you're welcome to correct me, because the fun thing about a decentralized organization is that it's always a little hard to get the data right, because everything changes and nobody knows everything. So this is a guess, like 25 people in paid roles, who knows, 200 members, something like that. I think we're approaching 200 right now. And I counted the circles, and it looks like it's around 58. But hey, this changes every week, right? So this is kind of a snapshot. And yeah, so you see right now, September 2021. Okay. I want to talk. Oh, actually, no, I put this as a reminder to myself to go to the Kumu map. Let me clean this up a little. So the Kumu map, as many of you know, is what we use to show our circles, and this gets generated dynamically, and I have great joy in bouncing these things around till they're in a position where I want them. Um, and so this is our current circle structure, and I want to just talk a little bit about the different departments here. So our main production, so to speak, is building that global community of practice of people who use sociocracy, basically connecting everybody to everybody who uses sociocracy in a certain area or who teaches, who wants to learn, so that they find more people who are doing something similar. Because well, I should say 5 years ago, you could still kind of trace each person who knew about sociocracy to somebody who kind of was a trainer who also knew, and so on. But that's long, long over. It's just been like we're now in this like community spread, as I would call it, for a virus, right? It's not spreading like from that patient zero or patient one or two. Now it's just hard to trace at all. And that's fun. That's, of course, exactly what we want to see. So anyway, that overall global community of people who are into sociocracy or closely related system, that is basically who we have in mind and who we're trying to connect, and of course also growing that community because we think that sociocracy is a good thing to spread. And part of what we're doing is then just content production in a broad sense. So that's kind of the production line of Sociocracy for All. So that's training is content, so to speak. Outreach is content, so to speak, and content production is itself, right? Like webinars, bylaws, samples, training courses, article writing, books, and so on. And then in outreach, we have all the different kinds of outreach. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later also when we talk about the sector roadmap. Website is basically under outreach, which is an interesting concept as well, to really just put it where it's being used. Then the other pieces are the global community under a certain aspect. I'll talk about that more in a second. So you can see here sociocracy in different areas, like sociocracy in permaculture, sociocracy in co-ops, and intention communities, and so on. And this shifts from time to time. There's actually a new circle that was just formed that is not on here yet, and that tends to happen, right? And I know something that is going to plan to shift, and so on. But that's all just the normal life in a kind of ever shifting organization. Then this international circle, that's the department where people look at the language communities and serve language communities. The biggest one by far is SOPRA, Sociocracia Practica. Here they are. And as you can see, they also have a bunch of subcircles. So that's almost, in a way, and one has to watch out what one is saying there, because it's a way of replicating, basically, way of replicating what's happening here. So training circle, for example, is here. That's Spanish word for training, and then here's training, right? And you see some, like content circle has its counterpart here. And activism, for example, is very similar to what's here. And similar, for example, in SOFA Scandinavia, they have training and content, right? So there's a relationship there, is what I'm saying. And how one does that is an interesting thing. And I know that many organizations struggle with that, of how do you hold topics and language at the same time. And it's not trivial, and we also struggle with it a little bit, but we now found a way of at least conceptualizing it well. Okay, let's see. Oh, then of course membership. Sorry, I forgot that. Membership is basically the internal service, right, of making sure that Sociocracy for All is a pleasant organization to be in for members, and that then includes finances, so make sure that everything is running, and also budgeting and staffing as subcircles of that. So everybody who gets hired by SOFA that gets supported here in staffing circle. So that's just basically being a membership organization will automatically come with these, right? So if you think of it in principle, there's really three areas if you look at it that way. the production, then the self-supporting part, and then the more community-oriented part, and community as in like the network overall. Okay, back here. What I find interesting about that is that the audience is, I'm sorry, this is flipped now. So now content circle is here, now, and the international circle is here, and ecosystems here. So it's, I think, I don't know. I think it's flipped by maybe 180 degrees. I'm not sure. So the audiences here are very different. So in the audience in this red department and content circle are basically sociocracy learners and teachers, right? So the people who will know about sociocracy, who are learning right now, academy students and so on. The people who read our stuff, that they typically read things because they want to learn. So that's the audience here. Then the audience here is practitioners in sociocratic organizations, or people who serve practitioners in sociocratic organizations. One interesting thing here is that there's basically two layers to it. One is, and that speaks to the community of practice and the sector circle difference. So what we found is that if you get together, let's say, all the people who are interested in sociocracy in schools, you will attract two different kinds of people. One is the people who use sociocracy in schools, and then there are the people who want to bring sociocracy to schools. They might also be practitioners using sociocracy in schools, but they might have a more strategic interest in bringing sociocracy into schools instead of just basically having the involvement just confined to the school that they're in and not really looking left and right, because all they want to do is make their own school better. And all of those needs, of course, are completely valid. They're just different. So now we've started to really separate out that more more clearly. So for example, and that's been around for a while here, and you cannot really read that, intentional community circle. These are the people who are working on bringing sociocracy to intentional communities. For example, there's going to be a conference in November for sociocracy in intentional communities, and that is being put on by this circle. This group is a group of 20 or so people who are in sociocratic communities that just meet once a month and talk to each other. So this is a community of practice, while this is the corresponding sector circle. A similar situation we have with schools, but now we have, it's not represented here yet, but we have a school development circle that does exactly what this circle is doing, just for schools, also putting on a conference and so on, taking care of the sociocracy in schools page and so on. And there is a school's community of practice of people who just want to talk to each other without going anywhere with it, right? Just supporting each other. So that's an interesting difference. And many of those have now been asked by Ecosystem Circle to become clear about what it is that they are. Are you a community of practice or are you a circle? Which is an interesting question to ask a group, actually, because that way you really have to make that difference and have that conversation of, well, is it something that you want to actively put time in to bring it to other people, or does it end with you, basically? Again, all of that is valid. It just needs to be clear. So again, the audience here are practitioners, and the audience here are people in language communities, which is very kind of very similar to this, right? It's just a different way of chunking it. Here it's by language, and there it's by sector. And then the audience here is everybody who's a member, including staff, of course. So now the interesting thing is, of course, that one given individual person could fall into all of these audiences. You could have somebody who is, and I'm actually thinking of a concrete person who is staff into permaculture, Actually not active here. Maybe I have to think of somebody else, but that could happen. Or if we take somebody like Sophie, for example, that like somebody could be in all of those areas, or in all of be a part of all of these audiences. As a student, they're listening here, right? As a permaculture promoter, they sit here, and as a member of some language community, they sit here, and they are members. So you could be all of those things. It's not disjoint groups. It's just a different way of looking at them. Then, of course, just for completeness, you all know what a general circle is, just saying it out loud. Two people from each of these circles, the double link to the mission circle as well. I am the top-down link as the leader of the general circle. I'm also leader of content circle. And we have a delegate here, which is Nora. Okay. Going to those special concepts, help desks. And for that, I need to go back very quick. A help desk is needed because if we have, for example, what actually happened, wait, I'm trying to find the circle. Intentional Community Circle wants to put on a conference. As I said, they're doing, right? Now, putting on a conference is its own unique skill set, right? Event planning, where you need to know a little bit of the systems of how does the email list work in SOFA? How do you run a conference? What do you do with the Zoom rooms? How do you send people, how do you set up the tickets and the website and so on? Those are unique event planning skills. And then these people, of course, the intentional communities people, they know exactly what their audience is. They have a sense of what kind of talks they want at that conference and so on. So saying that this group prepares the conference by themselves, that would be a big ask. And in our experience, that doesn't work so well because many of these people will be volunteers and they simply don't have the insight into the systems level of SOFA. So they wouldn't be able to make use of it as well as they could if somebody helped them from kind of who's more embedded into the internal systems. Let's look at it the other way. If we say conference circle here, we're preparing the conference, then we would not have anybody who actually even knows what the program should look like and so on. So it's clear that there has to be a collaboration between conference circle and intentional community circle. They bring the event planning and the systems, and they bring the subject matter expertise. Now, what does that collaboration look like? And that was something that isn't so trivial. Of course, one could just form, and that's somewhat also what we do, kind of a circle that has some people from here and some people from here. Yet it's not so clear to figure out the domains. Another piece of that is that, and that gets a little abstract, so that there's always the tension between centralization of topics and decentralization of topics, or of skills and anything really, resources also. So if you centralize a lot, then you can really pull together the people who know exactly how to pop out a conference, right? And that's of course desirable that the centralized and the expertise can build, and they know exactly where stuff is and how to do it, and they can just do it. Well, if we decentralize, and now we have many places to do those things, but now we're stretching people a little bit thin, right? So that's also an effect that we see with webinars, for example. If Permaculture Circle wants to put on a webinar, again, we have the same situation, writing articles. So there's website, and like, so that we have many of those relationships where we have somebody who knows how to do it and somebody who wants to use that service, which is how we conceptualize it. In a way now, Conference Circle, in the way we are setting it up right now, or we have set it up, Conference Circle has two different tasks. First, putting on conferences. And the second, helping other circles putting on conferences. The first one is the work circle and aspect, and the second one is the help desk function that they have. I think I have that. I'll get to that. Okay. Same with Webinar Circle. Webinar Circle is putting on webinars and can also team up with them to support them in putting on events. So how that works is, here's a little bit he's just one slide, that's why it looks different, taken out of a little information brochure kind of about putting on conferences. So now we see conference circle here, and we see, for example, intentional community circle here. They contribute the programming, they can contribute the organizing support, and they form a helping circle, or conference circle forms a helping circle where we have all of those things together. Yet, in order to do that well, they need to make what we call a domain activity agreement. And what that is simply that this circle has a list of things that typically need to be decided in order to run a conference. And they can tell their internal client, so to speak, of like the person who comes and says, I want to book the service of getting support for organizing a conference. And then they say, sure, here's our menu of what needs to be done. Which of those do you want to do? And which of those are we going to do? And this is from that same slideshow, what we do and what you do. So this is just a way of how it could be, for example, for any given conference. So the sector circle, for example, sets the date, or, because, for example, a school conference, you can really only host on a weekend because people are obviously in school during the week. So there's no point in doing it on a weekday. So that is something that the people who know this conference know well. At work, like a workplace oriented conference, I would do on a weekday, right? So that has to do with who your audience is. And then you can look at that in a quiet moment. I can also send you that. The whole point being that we have to create a system where all of these things mesh like two combs that fit exactly into each other so that everybody knows what they're doing. And with that agreement, you're now very free to decide all kinds of things. For example, if Permaculture Circle knows how to do these things because I've already done it 3 times, then almost everything could have a check here. Well, if it's a sector circle that is doing it for the first time, almost everything could be taken over here. And that gives us a lot of playing, like a lot of leeway in how much we want to centralize and how much we want to decentralize, because really every single one of these check marks is either pointing towards decentralization or centralization. And that makes the whole thing so flexible. And these can be one-offs, so that for that one conference we decide that, or it could also be standing agreements. For example, if the question is between Website Circle and Permaculture Circle, is Permaculture Circle completely taking over the Sociocracy Permaculture website? Then basically permanently we just say, you guys do that. Website Circle is going to stay out of it. But for some other circles, Website Circle is basically taking it over completely because that sector circle might not be ready to take the responsibility. So again, it's very kind of fluid and can really be held well in that system. Okay, next topic. I've already talked a little bit about the difference between community of practice and circle. A circle has a name and a domain. We know what that means. They have something that they're doing together, and they have the domain of this is the things that they're in charge of. So it's always a good example to use websites, because we all have a sense of what happens if you mess around with a website that you don't really have the rights or the expertise to mess with, right? You can break things, obviously. So the question is, for any given site, whose domain is it in? Who gets to play them? Who gets to just change something then? So a circle would have its domain, while a community of practice only has an aim, and that could be, so to speak, a self-serving aim. And there's no judgment in that, again, right? Because being a community of practice is great. It's just that they're not taking a piece, like a chunk of what needs to be done in the organization. They're just serving each other and themselves. In that way, so they support each other. They are not taking anything away. If this community of practice for intentional communities doesn't meet anymore, it's not like if Webinar Circle doesn't meet anymore, because webinars are like a key product that we've agreed on having. So that is a chunk of the domain that needs to be somewhere, while they can meet twice, not at all. They can triple and have 3 communities of practice. It makes no difference for the core functioning of the organization. And that's the difference. So nobody steps on each other's toes, because if 20 people talk in 3 groups about the experience of sociocracy in their community, that's great. More talking is good, and they're not taking anything away from each other. While obviously, if we had 3 webinar circles, that would be tricky, right? Because now the question is, wait, like, who puts out their webinars, and what do we do if it's conflicting in some way? Then a circle, just for completeness here, needs to have defined membership so we know who the decision makers are, while a community of practice can be looser, right? So you can basically have a walk-in community of practice. It doesn't really matter because, again, they're not in charge of any defined part of the organization, so nobody can really break anything. It's all good. What I dream of actually is if I go to this. We've looked at this and that gets really nerdy, so I'm just going to say it real quickly. So what we see here is basically that schools has a community of practice. Co-ops could have one, and consultant circle is actually discussing which one they are, and so on. Okay. Now it could almost have like another ring around it of communities of practice, right? A little bit like, I don't know what to call it, like an extra concentric ring that has that like the network around the organization in a way. The whole thing could also be the case for here, right? There might be people who are not interested in pushing sociocracy in French, but they want to talk to others in French about the experience with sociocracy, right? So now we have basically a whole ring of people who are interested in the community of practice around it. I struggle to, I mean, really the community of practice for membership would be just members chatting to each other and just having a good time with each other. So that in a way exists. Could also happen with staff. I'm not sure. That makes a little bit less sense, but that again is something that can happen. And then in a way, we saw something like this also, the same effect, of course, with learners, right? Learners can meet just for each other and themselves. But if we have a community of practice of people who, for example, practice using sociocratic or doing sociocratic selection processes, right? And that's what they do. That's great. But if there's 10 people practicing that and then another set of people practicing it, they're not taking away from each other. So it's also a community of practice. While if you have 2 training circles planning trainings, they're going to step on each other's toes. And that's the litmus test, right? To test whether something is a community of practice or whether it's a circle. Circles own a piece that is unique, while communities of practice can be duplicated completely. So anyway, what I'm dreaming of, and what we're all, like, some of us are dreaming together about, that is to build like a whole ring of the network of people who are interested in writing, learning, trying things out, practicing, talking in their language, talking in their sector, and to support that. Because in a way, and that goes along with my my theory of change, I'm really interested in the peer support aspect of it, because that's all I want sociocracy to grow, of people supporting each other instead of, kind of the expert driven change. So that's that. Let's go here. What's the next thing? Oh yeah. Now the last or second to last thing that I wanted to say are these kind of chains of things that we've built. And I find that just interesting from a governance perspective. So as we all know, each of these circles make decisions in their domain completely on their own. Nobody here in Training Circle can go to, let's find a better example. Nobody in Outreach Circle can tell Social Media Circle what to do in the realm of social media, right? That's the point of domains and the decentralized decision making. Outreach Circle can't boss around Website Circle. It's all on the basis of mutual consent. Whatever they can, of course, agree on things, but then if they're both affected or their domains are affected, they need to make that decision together. So it's more like there's such a good word for that in German, when you make like a mutual self-commitment. And that's how you run things. So, and you can now think of that between website and outreach, that they would hatch, like, cook up a plan, and they would cook up a plan somewhat together, and then realize, oh, that actually fits together. If you do that, the thing that we're doing also works really well. Without anybody telling each other what to do, they can both decide that, knowing that the other circle is also deciding that, and that way it all fits together, and they just keep that in mind because they've committed themselves to aligning their efforts. And that could also happen across, right? It doesn't even have to be adjacent circles. It could be forum circle and ecosystems, which is actually something that is happening. They do talk and make these self-commitments about things. So, or forum circle and membership circle, as I heard him. So that happens quite a bit, and that's of course extra sweet. So now one example of what we call the sector roadmap is that audience circle looks at all these different interests, because that's something that we can track, what people are interested in and so on. Now, when they notice that some special interest, let's say, just as an example, let's use sociocracy in higher education, universities and so on. That is kind of on the horizon. I know several people who are interested in that, right? Like, I know several sectors like that that are kind of coming up right now. So in the audience circle, we notice that. Then we talk about it to outreach circle. Outreach circle might then tell social media circle of, like, hey, how about we, talk about that a little bit, or on the forum. So, and then it goes to content circle as, like, hey, everybody in this department, I think we should be aware of universities. That seems to be coming up. And then they can say, hey, is this right to do like a whole training just related to that? Would that be interesting? Or it can go then into content production, like, could we do a webinar on sociocracy in higher ed? Could we start people to write things? What do they need in terms of templates, right? Like, these are all things that could be coming up. Conference, of course. So that's where it kind of crawls into those spaces, right? And then it goes to ecosystems, because ultimately in 5 years, ideally, there would be a community of practice of people who are in higher education and using sociocracy that want to find a space to talk to each other. It's not quite enough people yet, but I think in 5 years it will. And then as the next step, there would be the separation between community of practice and the people who are pushing it. By that time, in 5 years, there would probably be people who are interested in actively promoting sociocracy in universities, because that's the area of expertise, that's where the passion is in changing the world there. And this is basically like a pipeline that we built and that we are aware of, that all happens on mutual self-commitment between the circles. So we decided that audience circle is holding that pipeline, but it depends on the goodwill and the good intentions of all of these on the way to play along and are aware of the same concept, so that we speak the same language on this. And that's one of those pipelines that we built. And here you can see a little bit of kind of what that looks like, of how these things go on and on and on. It's not the most current version, honestly, but it's one that I could easily take a picture of what that means. Like many of those things I also said, like webinars, case studies could be written, and so on in this phase. And that's really sweet for us to kind of track that interest and put our finger on, oh, sociocracy in higher education is about here right now, right? While sociocracy in co-ops, that's here, and I've seen the sector in the last few years go from one end to the other, like from one side of the spectrum to the other. It just happens like that. Then growing edges, decentralization. In this kind of decentralized system, it really is a struggle to keep everything straight. One has to spend a lot more time in cleaning things up, right? As those people who I so far know, and I'm sure the others know too from their own organizations. What I've noticed there is that there are a few bottlenecks that we still don't have a perfect answer to. We have some of an answer, but not fully. One is the bottleneck around budgeting. Because, for example, if we want to empower um, school development circle to be hiring people as they see fit, we need to have a system for that, so not everything has to run through the bottleneck somewhere. So basically, how do you decentralize HR? How do you decentralize the system support? How do you decentralize documentation? How do you decentralize onboarding of people into circles? Like all of that needs to be decentralized to really be free to do all those things. And it's really hard to do because it also means everybody who is in a circle needs to learn how to budget. Everybody needs to learn, like, there's just, you have to train so many people. And that's why I feel the tension between centralization and decentralization, because sometimes I also feel that urge of saying, just wanting to say, like, just centralize it, like it's just so much more work in some areas to decentralize than to just do it. And where that breaking point is of when is it worth putting in the effort of decentralizing it, that's a little bit of a question always, right? Like, and do you have the resources to do that? So that's an interesting kind of angle to look at it that I enjoy thinking about quite a bit. And I think I'm complete, so I will stop. Well, I've already stopped screen sharing. I've said everything I wanted to say. I see here one question in the chat that I'll just go to now. Where are the bottlenecks in the communication pipeline? What are the best practices for cross-circuit connections? Yes, and that is part of the reason why we were pushing the forum so hard. So for those of you who are not in SOFA, the forum is, as you can imagine, a forum. And there is both a member, like a section for members, and also an open public forum. But our main pain point really was the member part of it, so that we could have a space where, let's say, Webinar Circle can get input from all kinds of people, right, who are not in the circle or in the parent circle. So it can really be broader, like more many-to-many conversation. And since we're all in different time zones, because members are from all over the world, meetings and also language differences and so on, meetings are not an option for that. While in a community, like in a living community, people talk to each other, in the common house or over dinner, or they know each other from, I don't know, yoga. That doesn't happen for SOFA, right? Because we're all in very different spaces. So that's also the pain and the opportunity of a global decentralized organization. So the forum, we hope, is going to grow into that, just as second nature of asking on the forum, because we don't know what else could fill that spot. The other one is good communication and good documentation, right? One thing that I'm hoping we'll get to, but that's really a matter of resources and time, is that every circle, especially every help desk circle, every circle that has a help desk function, offers basically a document like this. Hold on. So you went to the one that I was copying from, right? Screen sharing that. Like all the information of, okay, you want to host a conference? Here's what you need to know. You want to host a webinar? Here's what you need to know. You want to hire somebody? Here's what you need to know. And I've been starting to write some of the documentation, and that I hope will make things easier. How do you make the decision? Yeah, we are at a tipping point within our organization and struggling to justify a fully decentralized system that does not seem to be viable in our organization, however keen to explore other ways to operate. Yeah, and that's really why I want to go to that help desk thing, right? Because it really, you can kind of dial, it's not an all or nothing. You can dial it a little bit more smoothly in the middle. You can say, oh, how about we um centralize everything that has to do with websites, because not everybody in the organization has website skills. Or maybe it's budget for you, or maybe it's, whatever it might be. You kind of, it depends on where your organization is and what kind of people are in it, right? But yeah, giving, how do I say this? From talking today, I would say, I would centralize until centralizing creates so much friction that you have to decentralize. Just like forming a subcircle should only happen when you really need to, right? So budding out as you need to, decentralization as you need to. And what we've noticed in SOFA actually And I've just realized that looking back is that we were growing from centralized to more decentralized, kind of in a big jump in the last year in the level of decentralization. And that did slow us down because it takes energy to decentralize, right? So I think it was necessary, but I also see some, sometimes I do have the moments of thinking like, oh, things used to be simpler when I just did them, right? Um, and I realize that's just not where we are anymore. So what I'm saying, I guess, is it needs some compassion with ourselves also, and not everything that's centralized is bad, right? So it's one needs to know what one uses it for and when it's easier to do what, I guess.